There's been a lot of chatter and discussion around the neighborhood ratings, exactly how they're calculated. We know the metrics that Upland has chosen, but we don't know exactly how it's calculated, and it's difficult for people to take a look at the leaderboard and see how they can actually influence the ratings and help their neighborhood move up in the rankings. If you haven't watched the video that I created explaining exactly how these neighborhood ratings work, take a look at the link in the upper right-hand corner. Some people have been asking me my thoughts on the neighborhood ratings, and I want to share them with you in this video. I've had some time to ponder it over, and I've thought of some other metrics that I think would be beneficial in helping to determine which neighborhood is in fact the strongest and the best neighborhood in Upland. Here on the Upland Guide website, we can see here the 5 different metrics that Upland is using to determine what the top neighborhood is. And I said that the player base is not able to calculate exactly how these neighborhood ratings work because these 5 metrics are most likely not weighted equally, and there are additional factors on different neighborhoods based on their size. So it's very difficult to compare a tiny neighborhood which has 300 properties to a neighborhood that has 4,000 properties. So Upland has added additional factors to help somehow level the playing field. Now, these metrics were just announced in March of 2023, and we can expect these metrics to not only change, but also evolve as time goes on. There are a lot of features that have yet to be implemented that absolutely would have an influence on how strong a community is. And once those get implemented, then they will also factor in some way into these calculations. With these metrics, Upland is starting to lay the groundwork and explain what things are important when you're creating a neighborhood and building up your community. Just like with all sorts of new features, players always look for different loopholes and ways to hack the system, and I'm sure that once players start to find these, then Upland will start to close these holes and change the metrics in a way that the playing field is level and that a few select players are not able to completely manipulate the market in a way that is unfair for the entire collective of the metaverse. Now, having said that, let's take a look at this first metric and my suggestion on how to improve it. The first metric is taking a look at the average number of spark hours allocated per property for building structures. Now, my issue with this metric is that it takes into account all of the properties in the neighborhood. There are some neighborhoods that in Upland that are very problematic in terms of building. The perfect example is Manhattan. There are lots of tiny properties in Manhattan that not even a micro house can fit on, partially because they're too narrow. So for players to look to develop those neighborhoods and add structures onto it, it makes it extremely difficult. So for these types of neighborhoods, they're already at a disadvantage in terms of this metric because there are lots of properties that simply can't be built upon. Now, the way to fix this, in my opinion, would be to take the same metric, the total number of spark hours that have been invested in building up structures, dividing it by the number of properties, such as they have suggested, but further dividing that by the median size of the properties in that neighborhood. If you're unfamiliar with the term median, I'm going to be using it again in this video. The median means taking the middle number. So in this instance, when we're looking at all of the properties and we're talking about property sizes, you're going to sort them from lowest to highest. And if there's 500 properties in that neighborhood, you're going to look at the 250th ranked property and find out what the corresponding size of that is. Now, the reason that I prefer looking at the median number as opposed to the average number is that all of the super tiny properties and all of the extra large properties are going to have less of an influence on the statistic that is being used. So in this imaginary neighborhood of 500 properties, if there are 499 properties that are 30 up squared and one property that is 5,000 up squared, then when you rank all of those properties, the middle property that is ranked is still going to be that 30 up squared. So that 5,000 up squared property is not going to have an influence on the median in this instance, and potentially skew the data in a way that is heavily weighted towards a specific outlier. So by normalizing this metric over the median size of the properties, it can help to determine the average amount of spark that is used in construction per up squared and not per property. The second metric that we have here is the average number of residents with a designed upland home address per property. The first metric talks about how much of the neighborhood is actually constructed. And the second one here is talking about how many people actually live there. Now, in my opinion, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to have a neighborhood that is completely built up but does not have a lot of residents. Now, I completely understand that there are still features that are missing, like being able to rent out your apartment to somebody else. There will also be a different number of living units in each structure. So if you have a apartment building versus a small townhouse, there are going to be a different number of people that can actually live in that structure. So these are future features that are absolutely going to factor into this neighborhood rating. And I know that things like this don't have a big influence right now in the game, but I am really thinking about these metrics as a long-term idea. So having said that, if there's going to be a lot of supply of these living units or structures on these properties, but there isn't the demand for people to live in them, then that is not something that shows strength to a specific neighborhood. So in order to find the actual balance between the amount of structures that there are and the living units that exist versus the amount of people that are populating it, I want to look at something that's called the residential capacity. And that is essentially not taking a look at the total number of properties that exist in the neighborhood, but look at the number of properties that have structures built upon them. So in this scenario, if there's a neighborhood with 100 properties, but only 10 of them have buildings on them, but each one of those 10 buildings has someone who has defined that as their permanent residence, then that should be extra bonus points for them, where they have 100% capacity. Now you're probably saying, YK 2012, that's not fair. The whole point is to build more buildings, not to have less buildings. And that's the whole point of the very first metric. So in the first metric, you're getting points for creating a lot of buildings. But in the second metric, you want to make sure that all of the buildings that you have people who are living there and populating them. Otherwise, these abandoned buildings should not be giving you extra bonus points towards your neighborhood rating. This will encourage neighborhoods to create building as there is demand for it, and also to be more strategic around when to build and where to build. The third metric is average number of Metaventures per property. Now, this one is also problematic in my opinion, because as I mentioned in the very first metric, if I have a property that can't even fit a structure, then in this metric, I will actually be losing points because there is no opportunity for me to even build a metaventure there if I wanted to. In addition to that, maybe there's a property that I just don't want to build on. I want to put some map assets there, or maybe in the future, some trees or some animals using the life token, which will come into play, and there won't be any structures there. And by design, there won't be any structures there. This should not be something that should be factored into this metric, in my opinion. So in order to get around this, I want to look at the number of properties that are actually utilized in the neighborhood that have structures. So if there's 100 properties in the neighborhood and I decide that I'm going to construct some sort of a structure on 50 of them or 50% of the buildings, then of those 50% of the buildings, I want to know how many of them are actually being utilized, whether it be that the property is being utilized as a home or it's being utilized as any type of metaventure. So if on those 50 properties that have some sort of a structure, and let's say I have 5 metaventures and another 20 players who have set one of these homes as their home address, then that's 25 out of the 50. So that would be a 50% score. This again ties into what I think is building with a purpose. So if you're going to construct a structure, it should be for a specific purpose, not just in order to boost the average number of spark hours allocated per property for the building structures, which is the very first metric. Also in the future with things like living units, and let's say I have a street full of apartments and each apartment has 8 living units, meaning that 8 people can live in each apartment. If I have one apartment can complete capacity and all of the other apartments on that street with 0 people living in them, then that is not a good property and structure utilization on that street. If, however, instead of having 8 people living in one apartment, you had one person living in 8 apartments, then that would give you a better score on this specific metric, the way that I envision it. Now, here you could probably also say, in the previous metric, you talked about the number of residents, so why are you factoring it in once again in this second metric? And I think that the number of residents that you have in a neighborhood is something that is extremely important, and that should probably be the most important metric, as Creating a community is really based on how many people are willing to identify as being part of that community. And I think that by setting your home address in a specific neighborhood and having everybody being able to see that by going into your profile, I think that is something that is a really good indicator of community. Metric number 4 is the average spark hours allocated for map asset manufacturing per property. And this one's going to be a bit short. I want to change this from average spark hours to median spark hours. And again, this is because that any of the outliers, meaning the smallest and the largest map assets in terms of spark hours, have less influence on the actual metric. So if there are a small number of map assets that have a lot of spark hours, and there was one player who owned these and he just moved all of these from one neighborhood to another neighborhood, with this average metric, that could have a much larger influence. And in order to isolate that, using the median can be a good idea. The last metric that we have here is the average UPEX contributed to the community pool each month per property. And this is broken down into 3 different items. The first one being 10% of the sales price of properties on the secondary market, 5% of sales price on items in Metaventures, and the third is the venture dues paid by all Metaventure owners at the beginning of each month. And on each one of these 3 items, I have a way to fix it. I'm going to start with the last one being the venture dues. This one we have to just completely scrap because it is completely irrelevant. The amount of venture dues that a Metaventure owner pays has less to do with that specific Metaventure, but more to do with all of the Metaventures of that type in the same city. So when we're actually looking here at the strength of a neighborhood, but you're looking at a metric that deals with the city itself, then this is just a poor metric. I can understand why they factor it in because this is one of the things that is contributed into the community pool. So it is a little bit easier to package. So when we're talking about UPEX that is contributed to the community pool, it does make sense to have it in here. But I think if the idea is to get things right and not to make things simple, then we have to do away with this point altogether. The second factor here of the 5% of the sales price of items in Metaventures, that being the price paid by the buyers, I want to keep that, but I want to add something else onto that, and that would actually be looking at the median price of some of these items. Now let's take, for example, a Metaventure that sells 100 items in a specific month, and each one of those items is sold for $1. And you compare that to a different Metaventure that maybe only sold one item all month, but that item cost $100. I think that there should be some sort of reward in terms of the neighborhood ratings that would reward a Metaventure who is able to sell these high ticket items. And again, I think that if we look at the median sales price of some of these items in Metaventure stores, then we can actually see which stores are selling these more high value items and reward that in terms of the neighborhood ratings. Now, whether it be the actual median or we want to take a different number, maybe be the 75th percentile or the 80th percentile or whatever you choose, it doesn't really matter, but I think that this is something that should be factored in addition to the total amount of sales that are done through these Metaventures. Now, the last contribution is the 10% of sale prices on properties on the secondary market. And that comes from 5% from the seller and 5% from the buyer that goes into the community pool. Now, the problem with this metric, the way it's built at the moment, is that if you compare, let's say, a neighborhood of the exact same size in London versus Bakersfield, where London is a tier 1 city and Bakersfield is a tier 5 city, the original base prices of these properties are on completely different spectrums. So it makes complete sense that any resale prices on properties in any neighborhood in London would be much more than that in Bakersfield. So we have to find a way to actually level that playing field. And the way to do that is to normalize these sales based on the neighborhood value. The neighborhood value is a fixed number that Upland gives to each neighborhood in Upland before the city is released. And the mint price is calculated based on this neighborhood value, which is equal for all of the properties within that neighborhood, multiplied by the size of the property and up squared. So by factoring in this neighborhood value and normalizing these prices based off of that, you are able to better compare these different neighborhoods in different cities that are of different tiers and different neighborhood values. So to summarize, I think that Upland has created some metrics that are really starting to point Upland in the right direction in terms of how players should start collaborating and building up these neighborhoods. However, these metrics take into some things that are quite problematic. One of them being that not all properties can have structures on them. And when you divide things by the total number of properties, neighborhoods with extra small property sizes that won't be able to fit any structures on them are at a disadvantage. Secondly, Upland likes to use the average in a lot of instances, and I prefer the median because the outlier values have less of an influence on the metric itself. There are still a lot of features that have yet to be introduced into Upland, like living units, and also how the calculation of structure ornaments will factor into these neighborhood ratings as well. They talk about map assets, but not structure ornaments or vehicles. So these are other important things that also need to be factored in, and I'm sure that they will be as time goes on. What do you think about the metrics that I've proposed? Let me know in the comments below.